In a perfect world, the phrase public servant would mean exactly that, someone who serves the public. But, and this is hardly a spoiler, we do not live in a perfect world. We live in a world where power, more often than not, acts as a corrosive acid, eating away at integrity, accountability, and the very foundations of justice. It's a world where the people entrusted with the keys to the kingdom are often the first ones to loot the treasury, sell the furniture, and rent out the throne room for lavish, ethically bankrupt parties. It's a sad, predictable, and frankly infuriating cycle. Tonight, we're going to take a little stroll through a gallery of political figures who, in the court of public opinion, have been found spectacularly wanting. These aren't just your run-of-the-mill made a gaffe on a hot mic politicians. No, these are the titans of scandal, the maestros of malfeasance, the individuals whose careers are so riddled with accusations of corruption, abuse of power, and outright criminality that the question isn't if they broke the law, but how they've managed to stay out of a jail cell for so long. So buckle up, because we are about to dive deep into the murky waters of political impunity. We're talking about leaders who allegedly treated national treasuries like their personal piggy banks and saw human rights as optional suggestions. This is a list of 10 individuals who, according to mountains of evidence and waves of public outrage, arguably traded their pinstripe suits for a set of prison stripes a long time ago. Let's get started, shall we? Richard Milhous Nixon, the man whose name became a suffix for political scandals. Before Gate was attached to everything from deflated footballs to slightly spicy guacamole, there was Watergate. It's the granddaddy of them all, the blueprint for modern political self-immolation. It started, as these things often do, with a seemingly minor crime, a bungled burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. A third-rate burglary, as the White House initially dismissed it. But that was just the loose thread. Pulling on that thread unraveled a tapestry of corruption so vast, so audacious, it almost beggars belief. We're talking about a secret slush fund to finance political espionage, enemies lists that read like a who's who of anyone who ever disagreed with him, and the weaponization of federal agencies like the IRS and FBI to harass political opponents. This wasn't just dirty politics. This was a systematic assault on the very machinery of democracy, orchestrated from the highest office in the land. It was the political equivalent of finding out the referee, the umpire, and the scorekeeper are all betting on the same team. And at the center of it all was Nixon himself, a man consumed by paranoia and a thirst for power. The Oval Office tapes, the very recordings he hoped would secure his legacy, instead became his undoing. They revealed a president who was profane, bigoted, and deeply involved in the cover-up. He wasn't just aware of the crimes, he was actively directing the conspiracy to conceal them, ordering his subordinates to lie to investigators and the American people. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings of a shadow government operating right under the public's nose. The evidence was overwhelming. The House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. His guilt was so undeniable that his own party's senators had to tell him the jig was up. He was staring down the barrel of certain impeachment and removal from office. He knew, everyone knew, he was caught. There was no escape, no clever rhetoric, no last-minute political maneuvering that could save him from the consequences of his actions. Or so you'd think. Facing that inescapable reality, he resigned in disgrace, the only United States president ever to do so. But here's the kicker, the final, infuriating twist in the saga. His successor, Gerald Ford, granted him a full, free, and absolute pardon. Just like that, he was off the hook. No trial, no conviction, no jail time. He famously declared, "I am not a crook," but his actions, and the subsequent pardon that shielded him from justice, left a permanent stain on the presidency and taught a generation of politicians a terrible lesson. If you're powerful enough, you can get away with almost anything. If you were to create a fictional character who was a billionaire media tycoon turned politician, known for lavish bunga parties, endless legal battles, and an almost supernatural ability to survive political scandals, your editor would probably tell you to tone it down. It's just too unbelievable. And yet, Italy gave us Silvio Berlusconi, a man who made fiction look tame. For decades, he dominated Italian life, not just as a politician, but as a cultural phenomenon, a walking, talking embodiment of excess. His political career was inextricably linked with his vast business empire, Mediaset. This created a conflict of interest so colossal it could be seen from space. He was accused, time and again, of crafting laws that just so happened to benefit his own companies or help him evade justice. It was less about governing a country and more about running a personal protection racket from the Prime Minister's office. He faced dozens of trials with charges ranging from embezzlement and false accounting to bribing a senator. One of his most infamous legal sagas involved tax fraud at Mediaset. The scheme was simple but effective. His companies bought TV rights from United States firms, but they did so through offshore shell companies he secretly controlled. These offshore companies would buy the rights and then sell them to Mediaset at a massively inflated price. The difference was skimmed off and stashed in secret bank accounts. It was a classic case of a billionaire allegedly using corporate shenanigans to dodge taxes and enrich himself, the very thing he was supposed to be preventing as a leader. Then, of course, there was the Rubygate scandal, which felt less like a political drama and more like a script for a bad European soap opera. He was accused of paying an underage prostitute, Karima El Maroug, also known as Ruby the Heart Stealer, for sex. When she was arrested for theft, Berlusconi allegedly pulled strings, calling the police station and claiming she was the niece of then-Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to secure her release. You cannot make this stuff up. He was trying to prevent a diplomatic incident that he himself had invented. Despite a conviction for tax fraud in 2013, which resulted in a ban from public office and a sentence of community service, Berlusconi never saw the inside of a prison cell. He used every legal trick in the book, appeals, statute of limitations, friendly legislation, to run out the clock. His supporters saw him as a persecuted martyr, a victim of biased magistrates. But for many others, he was Il Caimano, the Cayman, a predator who bent the state to his will and treated the rule of law as a minor inconvenience on his way to the next party. In South Africa, they have a term for the kind of systemic corruption that plagued the nation for nearly a decade: state capture. It's a chillingly accurate phrase. It means the state is no longer working for its people, but has been hijacked to serve the private interests of a corrupt few. And at the heart of this story, the man accused of handing over the keys to the state is former President Jacob Zuma. His presidency wasn't just marred by scandal, it was defined by it. The story of state capture is intrinsically linked to one family, the Guptas, three brothers who emigrated from India and built a sprawling business empire in South Africa. They weren't just friends with Zuma. They were allegedly his partners in crime. The allegations are breathtaking in their scope. The Guptas were said to have had so much influence that they could handpick cabinet ministers, direct state contracts to their own companies, and loot billions from state-owned enterprises like the National Energy Company, Eskom, and the rail agency, Transnet. This wasn't just about a few dodgy deals. This was about the wholesale auctioning of a country's sovereignty. Whistleblowers and journalists uncovered a web of corruption where public officials were allegedly bribed, threatened, and co-opted into the Gupta's network. Decisions that should have been made in the interest of 60 million South Africans were instead being made to benefit one family and their presidential protector. The Zondo Commission, a public inquiry into state capture, laid bare the devastating scale of the looting. But Zuma's legal troubles didn't start with the Guptas. Long before he was president, he was dogged by hundreds of corruption charges related to a 1999 arms deal. For years, he employed what became known as the Stalingrad strategy, using every legal appeal, every procedural delay, every trick imaginable to avoid his day in court. It was a war of attrition against the justice system, and for a long time it worked. He managed to become president despite the cloud of corruption hanging over him. Eventually, the pressure became too much. Facing impeachment and abandoned by his own party, the ANC, Zuma was forced to resign in 2018. In 2021, he was finally sentenced to 15 months in prison, not for the corruption charges, but for contempt of court after refusing to testify at the Zondo Commission. His imprisonment sparked riots and looting, a testament to his lingering political influence, but he was released on medical parole after just 2 months. For many South Africans, it was a frustratingly brief glimpse of accountability for a man who oversaw the systematic plundering of their country. Some leaders are accused of stealing millions, but honestly, Ferdinand Marcos was in a different league entirely. He and his wife, Imelda, are accused of stealing billions. Not just a bit of cash, but a fortune so vast it's estimated to be somewhere between 5 and 10 billion US dollars. They didn't just raid the treasury, they treated the entire Philippine economy as their personal fiefdom for over 2 decades. Their reign is, well, a textbook case of kleptocracy, rule by thieves. Marcos came to power in 1965 and, by 1972, declared martial law, really cementing his dictatorial control. This gave him absolute power, which he used to systematically plunder the nation's wealth. He and his cronies skimmed money from foreign loans, took kickbacks from government contracts, and seized control of the country's largest corporations, turning them into personal cash cows. They created monopolies in key industries like sugar and coconuts, impoverishing millions of farmers while they enriched themselves beyond imagination. The extravagance was legendary, honestly a symbol of the grotesque inequality they fostered. While many Filipinos lived in poverty, Imelda Marcos became infamous for her opulent lifestyle. She went on multi-million-dollar shopping sprees in New York and Rome, bought entire buildings in Manhattan, and most famously, amassed a collection of over 3,000 pairs of shoes. The shoes became a global symbol of greed and detachment from reality, a leather and heel monument to corruption. They weren't just footwear, they were evidence. But the crimes of the Marcos regime went far beyond theft. The period of martial law was a time of brutal repression. To maintain his grip on power, Marcos's regime engaged in widespread human rights abuses. According to historical commissions and human rights groups, tens of thousands of people were imprisoned, tens of thousands were tortured, and over 3,000 were killed or disappeared. Political opponents, student activists, journalists, and anyone deemed a threat to the regime were targeted by the military and police. In 1986, the Filipino people had finally had enough. The People Power Revolution, a series of massive, non-violent demonstrations, forced the Marcos family to flee the country. They were airlifted by the U.S. military to Hawaii, taking with them crates of cash, jewels, and gold. Although Marcos died in exile in 1989 without ever facing a conviction in the Philippines, the fight to recover the stolen wealth continues to this day. His rule stands as a horrifying reminder of how a dictator can bleed a nation dry, both financially and morally, leaving scars that last for generations. When Alberto Fujimori came to power in Peru in 1990, the country was on its knees, ravaged by hyperinflation and a brutal insurgency by the Shining Path terrorist group. He presented himself as a no-nonsense outsider, a strong man who could restore order. And to a certain extent, he did. He tamed inflation and dealt a decisive blow to the Shining Path. For this, many Peruvians hailed him as a hero. But the price of that order was terrifyingly high. In 1992, Fujimori, facing an opposition-controlled Congress, staged a self-coup. He dissolved Congress, suspended the Constitution, and assumed dictatorial powers with the backing of the military. This was his Fujigolpe, and it was the moment he traded democracy for authoritarian rule. He justified it as a necessary step to fight terrorism and reform the economy, but it was a blatant power grab that concentrated all state authority in his hands, with no checks and no balances. Under the guise of fighting terrorism, Fujimori's government unleashed a wave of horrific human rights abuses. He sanctioned the creation of death squads like the Grupo Colina, a military intelligence unit that operated as his personal hit squad. These squads were responsible for massacres of civilians, including the Barrios Altos massacre, where 15 people, including an 8-year-old boy, were killed at a party, and the La Cantuda massacre, where a professor and 9 students were abducted from their university, tortured, and murdered. And of course, where there's abuse of power, corruption is never far behind. Fujimori and his shadowy intelligence chief, Vladimiro Montesinos, oversaw a vast network of corruption. They bribed congressmen, judges, and media owners to maintain their grip on power. Tapes, secretly recorded by Montesinos himself, later emerged showing him handing over stacks of cash to politicians and executives. It was a government run on bribes, blackmail, and fear, a kleptocracy hidden behind the facade of a successful war on terror. After a decade in power, his regime collapsed in 2000 when the bribery tapes were leaked. Fujimori fled to Japan, his parents' homeland, and tried to resign by fax. Yes, by fax. He remained a fugitive for years before being arrested in Chile in 2005 and extradited to Peru. In a landmark ruling, he was convicted of human rights abuses for his role in the massacres and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was also convicted on multiple corruption charges. His case is a powerful, if rare, example of a former head of state being held accountable for the gravest of crimes. For some politicians, power is a family business. And for the Sharif family in Pakistan, it has been a very, very profitable business. Nawaz Sharif served as Prime Minister of Pakistan on 3 separate, non-consecutive occasions. His career has been a roller coaster of political power, military coups, exile, and comebacks. But one thing has remained constant throughout persistent, nagging, and ultimately damning allegations of corruption. The Sharifs are an industrial dynasty, and their immense wealth has always been a source of suspicion. How did a family of industrialists become one of the richest in the country, with assets stashed all over the world? For years, they deflected these questions. But in 2016, the music stopped. A massive leak of documents from a Panamanian law firm, Mossack Fonseca, known as the Panama Papers, blew the lid off the world of offshore finance. And right there, in the files, was the Sharif family. The papers revealed that Sharif's children owned several luxury apartments in London's exclusive Park Lane, held through offshore companies. This was the smoking gun. For years, Sharif had been unable to provide a clear money trail for how these multi-million-dollar properties were acquired. The Panama Papers provided the link, showing his family's connection to these secretive shell companies. The question was simple. Where did the money come from? Was it legitimate family wealth, or was it the proceeds of corruption, siphoned from the Pakistani state? This revelation sparked a political firestorm in Pakistan. The Supreme Court launched an investigation. Sharif and his family provided conflicting accounts. They produced a letter from a Qatari prince claiming the London flats were the result of a business deal from decades ago, a story so flimsy and convenient it was met with widespread ridicule. It felt less like a legal defense and more like a poorly written plot twist from a daytime drama. The court wasn't buying it. In 2017, the Supreme Court of Pakistan delivered a historic verdict. It disqualified Nawaz Sharif from holding public office for life, forcing him to resign as Prime Minister. The court stated he had not been honest and trustworthy. A year later, he was convicted on corruption charges related to the ownership of the London apartments and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Although he was later released on bail for medical treatment and has been living in London, the verdict was a landmark moment for accountability in a country where the powerful have often seemed untouchable. The story of Park Geun-hye, South Korea's first female president, is honestly one of the most bizarre political scandals of the 21st century. It's a tale of corruption, abuse of power, and, well, this strange Svengali-like figure who held sway over the nation's leader. But you know, it's less a story of a corrupt politician and more the story of a president who allegedly allowed her friend, a private citizen with absolutely no official position, to run the country like a puppet master. That friend was Choi Soon-sil, the daughter of a shady religious cult leader who had been a mentor to Park for decades. Choi was Park's confidant, her advisor, her everything. But their relationship went far beyond friendship. Choi allegedly had access to classified documents, edited the president's speeches, and even had a say in top government appointments. She was, for all intents and purposes, a shadow president, wielding immense power without a shred of democratic legitimacy. But wait, it gets worse. Park and Choi were accused of colluding to pressure some of South Korea's biggest conglomerates, including Samsung and Lotte, to donate tens of millions of dollars to 2 foundations that Choi controlled. It was, honestly, a classic shakedown scheme. The corporations would pay up, and in return, they'd receive political favors, like government approval for controversial mergers. The president of the country was allegedly acting as the chief enforcer for her friend's extortion racket. The scandal erupted when a tablet computer, believed to belong to Choi, was found by a news network. It contained confidential government documents and drafts of presidential speeches, proving just how incredible the extent of Choi's influence really was. The revelation sparked massive, peaceful candlelight protests across South Korea. Week after week, millions of citizens took to the streets demanding their president's resignation. It was a powerful display of people power against a leader they felt had profoundly betrayed their trust. The public outrage was so immense that in 2017, South Korea's parliament voted to impeach Park Geun-hye, a decision that was unanimously upheld by the Constitutional Court, officially removing her from office. Her downfall was swift and total. She was arrested and put on trial. In 2018, she was found guilty of bribery, abuse of power, and coercion, and sentenced to 24 years in prison. The case was a stunning fall from grace and a powerful testament to the strength of South Korea's democratic institutions. For 30 years, Hosni Mubarak ruled Egypt with, well, an iron fist. He was the modern Pharaoh, really, an unmovable fixture of Middle Eastern politics. His presidency was built on the foundations of a powerful military, a pervasive security state, and an emergency law that suspended constitutional rights and allowed for indefinite detention without trial. He maintained stability, sure, but it was the stability of a prison yard, enforced through fear and repression. Throughout his long reign, whispers of corruption grew into a roar. Mubarak, his family, and a close circle of cronies were accused of amassing a colossal fortune. Estimates of their wealth varied wildly, from just a few billion to a staggering $70 billion. The money allegedly came from everything: military contracts, state-owned enterprises, sweetheart business deals, and the systematic plunder of the nation's resources. While millions of Egyptians struggled with poverty and unemployment, the ruling elite lived in a world of unimaginable luxury. The system was one of patronage. If you were loyal to the regime, you could get rich. Businessmen who played ball were rewarded with monopolies and lucrative government contracts. Those who didn't were pushed out or punished. The economy was rigged in favor of the well-connected. The Mubaraks themselves reportedly acquired opulent residences, vast tracts of land, and secret offshore bank accounts, treating Egypt's national wealth as their personal inheritance. The breaking point came in 2011. Inspired by the revolution in Tunisia, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians poured into Cairo's Tahrir Square, demanding bread, freedom, and social justice. For 18 days, the world watched as a peaceful popular uprising refused to back down. They were protesting not just the lack of freedom, but also the rampant corruption that had defined Mubarak's rule. They were tired of a system that enriched the few at the expense of the many. Under immense pressure, Mubarak finally resigned, ending his 3-decade rule. The scenes of celebration in Tahrir Square were euphoric. Justice, it seemed, was finally coming. Mubarak and his sons were put on trial for corruption and for their role in the killing of protesters. However, the legal process that followed was messy and deeply unsatisfying for many Egyptians. After a series of trials and retrials, many of the charges were dropped or overturned. While he was convicted and served some time for embezzling state funds to upgrade his family homes, he was acquitted of the more serious charge of killing protesters. For many, it was a frustratingly light punishment for a man who oversaw decades of repression and looting. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known universally as Lula, is one of the most consequential and controversial figures in modern Latin American history. He was a former metal worker and union leader who rose to become the president of Brazil. During his presidency, from 2003 to 2010, millions were lifted out of poverty, and Brazil's economy boomed. He left office with an approval rating of over 80%, a political rock star beloved by his people. But a shadow was looming, and it had a name: Operation Car Wash, or Lava Jato in Portuguese. It started as a routine money laundering investigation in 2014, but quickly spiraled into the largest corruption scandal in Brazil's history. It uncovered a massive, systematic scheme of bribery centered on the state-owned oil giant, Petrobras. Construction companies would overcharge Petrobras for contracts and use the extra money to pay massive bribes to politicians and political parties in exchange for those contracts. It was a multi-billion-dollar kickback machine. While the scandal implicated politicians across the political spectrum, the focus inevitably fell on Lula and his Workers' Party, which had been in power for over a decade. Investigators alleged that Lula was a key beneficiary of the scheme. He wasn't accused of stuffing cash into a suitcase, but of receiving favors in the form of high-end real estate. The most famous case involved a luxury beachfront triplex apartment in Guarujá, which prosecutors said was renovated and furnished for him by one of the construction companies involved in the Petrobras scandal. Lula vehemently denied the charges, insisting he was the victim of a political witch hunt designed to stop him from running for president again in 2018, a race he was favored to win. His supporters saw the prosecution, led by the ambitious Judge Sergio Moro, as a lawfare campaign to destroy a left-wing icon. They argued that the evidence was flimsy, based largely on plea bargain testimony from a convicted executive, with no definitive paper trail proving Lula's ownership of the apartment. Despite the passionate defense, Lula was convicted of corruption and money laundering in 2017 and sentenced to prison. He surrendered to authorities in 2018 and spent 580 days behind bars, a stunning turn of events for the once revered leader. However, in a dramatic reversal, Brazil's Supreme Court annulled his convictions in 2021, ruling that the judge, Sergio Moro, had been biased. The ruling cleared the way for Lula's incredible political comeback, culminating in his victory in the 2022 presidential election. But for his critics, the annulment was a technicality, and the cloud of corruption has never truly disappeared. Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi as he's widely known, is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. He is a titan of Israeli politics, a divisive and dominant figure who has shaped the nation for decades. He cultivates an image as Mr. Security, the indispensable protector of the Jewish state. But for years, his political career has been shadowed by a series of corruption investigations that threaten to bring his long rule to an ignominious end. Netanyahu is the first sitting Israeli prime minister to be indicted on criminal charges. The allegations are spread across 3 separate cases, known as Case 1000, Case 2000, and Case 4000. They don't involve the kind of massive state-looting schemes we've seen elsewhere on this list. Instead, they paint a picture of a leader allegedly obsessed with his public image and willing to trade political favors for positive media coverage and a life of luxury funded by others. Case 1000, the illegal gifts case, alleges that Netanyahu and his wife received a steady supply of lavish gifts, including expensive cigars, pink champagne, and jewelry, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from wealthy billionaire friends, like Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan. In return, Netanyahu allegedly used his office to advance his friends' personal and business interests, including lobbying for a U.S. visa for Milchan. It's the classic "I'll scratch your back if you stalk my humidor" scenario. Case 2000 is even more brazen. It involves secret recordings of Netanyahu allegedly negotiating a deal with Arnon Noni Moses, the publisher of one of Israel's largest newspapers, Yedioth Ahronoth, which was highly critical of him. The proposed deal was simple. The newspaper would give Netanyahu more favorable coverage, and in exchange, Netanyahu would use his power to weaken a rival-free newspaper that was hurting Moses's business. It was a direct attempt to trade official acts for a media makeover. Finally, and most seriously, there's Case 4000, the bribery charge. Here, Netanyahu is accused of providing regulatory favors worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Shaul Elovich, the controlling shareholder of Bezek, Israel's largest telecom company. In exchange, Bezek's news website, Walla, allegedly provided Netanyahu and his family with glowing, meticulously managed coverage while smearing his political rivals. It was, prosecutors argue, a clear-cut case of bribery, the most serious charge a public official can face. Netanyahu denies all wrongdoing, claiming he is the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt by the media and a biased legal system. His ongoing trial is a battle not just for his freedom, but for his legacy and the very soul of Israeli democracy. And there you have it. 10 stories, 10 leaders, 10 cautionary tales of power sought, gained, and grotesquely abused. From the Americas to Asia, from Europe to Africa, the pattern is, well, depressingly familiar. The very individuals who swear an oath to uphold the law and serve their people are the ones accused of treating national treasuries as personal ATMs and constitutions as mere suggestions. The scale may differ, from luxury cigars to billions in state contracts, but the fundamental betrayal of public trust is the same. This is more than just a list of bad actors. It's a stark reminder that power without accountability is a recipe for disaster. Justice for these kinds of crimes is often slow, frustratingly incomplete, and sometimes it never comes at all. But the fight for it is essential. When we allow our leaders to operate above the law, we erode the very foundations of democracy. We send a message that the rules only apply to the powerless, and that the powerful can write their own. Ultimately, the responsibility for holding them to account falls to all of us. It falls to a free and fearless press that uncovers these scandals, to an independent judiciary that prosecutes them without fear or favor, and to an engaged citizenry that demands better. Public officials must be held to the absolute highest standards, not the lowest. Because if we don't demand justice, if we don't insist on accountability, We are doomed to watch this same sordid story play out over and over again. And that's a sequel nobody wants to see.